Hello, this is Sean with Breaking Culture, and today I'm bringing you the next installment of our Media and Cultural Theory case studies series. The purpose of this series is to dig into a particular case study using a key media theory. And the point of this, as I usually tell my students, is always to both use the theory to better understand the object that you're looking at and to evaluate how useful this theory is based on what it helps explain about this object. In our last video, we looked at the theory of semiotics and different kinds of signs, and we took apart the elements of this meme shared by the US White House on what they promised would be the eve of the military occupation of Chicago. We discussed the way that the many elements in this meme rely on the meanings that are generated by a certain context. We have to understand the meanings gleaned from the film Apocalypse Now, but also from the recent military occupation of Los Angeles and Washington, D.C. This leads us to an important set of concepts that are related to the way that meaning is always derived from a certain context, even if we have to operate imagining that they are natural, obvious, or an automatic outgrowth. So, the linguistic theory that we'll be talking about that serves at the foundation of myth and indeed for cultural theories as a whole has to do with the distinction between denotation and connotation, which helps us to understand the way that words become sites of struggle over meanings, powers, and values. So, to start with, the distinction between denotation and connotation breaks down like this: denotation is what we presume to be the literal given meaning of a term. So, if I show you a picture of this little animal, there will be no argument that it is a pig. Keep in mind, there is no pigness to this little animal. It has just become so widely accepted among the English speaking community that we call this animal a pig. This is why cultural studies scholar Stuart Hall argues that we can understand this distinction as analytical. For the purposes of our analysis, we will accept that there is some level on which signs are denotative, in part so that we can focus on the more contentious level of connotation. But in the same way that we might agree that these symbols denotatively stand in for fruits and vegetables, it is their connotation that is important. So, in contrast to denotation, where there's little argument about the relationship between signifier and signified, connotation is the level at which we can obviously see the way that meanings are generated through cultural practices and concerns. So, if I say that this image shows a pig, there will be obviously be all sorts of cultural meanings I'm drawing on. In the first place, we should also understand that even the denotative pigs are also understood in a certain way. As Samuel L. Jackson puts it, pigs are filthy animals. They're also greedy and will eat until they are very fat, a fact that breeders will exploit because, as John Travolta argues, bacon tastes good, pork chops taste good. There's a lot more in that Pulp Fiction conversation we could unpack. As semiotics adjacent cultural theorist Marshall Salins argues, regardless of whether animals are filthy like pigs or just dirty like dogs, our decision to eat them is more related to the relationships that we have with them. So we don't eat dogs or horses because we generally keep them as pets. But I digress. In addition to this connotation, the image shows a cop, who by some standards might be called heavyset. So saying this image illustrates a pig draws in part on forms of fat shaming, where the term pig is controversially used to describe people who are deemed overweight. But since this image is also a cop, it draws on a certain slang going back to the early 1800s, but which was made popular in American popular culture in the 1960s when activists adopted the term to refer to police officers or other authority figures, such as when the Yippies protested the 1968 Democratic Convention introducing their candidate for president called Pegasus, or when the Black Panthers, like Bobby Seale, regularly referred to cops as pigs in their writings and speeches. But when someone calls a cop or another authority figure a pig, we understand that this is a connotation. That on the one hand, it is drawing upon an already agreed upon denotation of this animal being understood as a pig, the connotation that says this animal is greedy, fat, and dirty, and is joined by connotations linked especially to police and other authority figures. But no matter how frequently we refer to cops as pigs, we understand that its power as a sign comes from this process of connotation. To take another example of this distinction, we can say that this, denotatively, is an American flag. On some level, there is a range of connotations here. For one thing, on a very basic level, we're looking at an image that is made up of red and white and blue dots and paint. The 50 stars uh, in this image represent the 50 states. The 13 stripes represent the original 13 colonies. But on a denotative level, we agree that this is, uncontroversially, an American flag. But when we place the American flag in a context like this, amplifying the nationalist imagery by using a bald eagle, the national bird, with the cursive scribbling signaling one of the country's founding documents, we get more of this nationalist imagery. Now the flag has a very particular connotation. Once you add the Statue of Liberty, the White House, 4th of July fireworks, and Iwo Jima to the mix, it is clear that this is not merely a flag. It is a sign of jingoistic national pride. The flag is not just a flag of a state, it sends a message of greatness, power, pride, and even joy at being associated with the nation. When we see a flag being burned, as it is in this case, possibly by a US citizen, it is a somewhat ambivalent connotation. On the one hand, it is clearly drawing on all of the other connotations. You burn a flag because it has all that other significance. But burning the flag is also a form of protected political speech. The First Amendment of the Constitution protects the freedom of speech and the freedom to protest. So, in a way, those other connotations are also being affirmed by the act of burning a flag, even as it offers a critique of that flag. In contrast, this image of burning a flag in a protest in another country doesn't stand as the same kind of protected speech, but it also doesn't rely on the internal connotations of nationalism and jingoism. To people around the world, the US flag means something very different. In many contexts, the United States military, the use of force, and other economic and diplomatic interventions in local politics and society are in direct contradiction to the principles of democracy, equality, and self determination that the flag is supposed to signify within the country. This is part of the connotation we could take from seeing the citizens of another country burn our flag. Or, as George W. Bush said of the 9/11 hijackers, we could just say that the connotation here is they hate our freedoms. And of course, even internally, the denotative flag can have connotative meanings given the history, context, and in some cases, actions of those flying it. When people point this out, they are often attacked. But in some ways, the connotation they are pointing to is exactly the one that someone flying the American flag means to express. Indeed, appropriating the American flag is a key part of the reactionary movements we've seen responding to the protests of the last decade or so. The Blue Lives Matter flag was developed almost immediately after the Black Lives Matter movement began protesting police brutality. Draining the flag of color and adding the single blue line is meant to signify what police call the thin blue line of protection that police provide, without which we would all descend into chaos and barbarism. But the fact that we are also seeing only black, white, and blue here, it is hard to overlook the racial implications, particularly given it is a response to the Black Lives Matter movement. In any case, we've come a long way from the denotative flag to this connotative one. And I won't even get into the Boogaloo Boys reappropriation of it. Well, we can see this process over and over in our daily lives, such as when the denotative tiki torch suddenly stood in for the connotative raging of white nationalists screaming like Nazis over the removal of a Confederate statue and killing another protester with their car, making it necessary for people to explain themselves if they were just using tiki torches for what we might call their denotative meaning. Likewise, the white folding chair, which was invented by a black man, became a symbol of black resistance and unity following a viral brawl on a Montgomery, Alabama dock in August 2023. In the incident, a black riverboat captain was attacked and a black man used a folding chair to defend him, sparking social media trends and merchandise referring to the event. Here, Saussure's critic V.N. Voloshinov is relevant. He argues that while it may be true that signs represent a certain agreed upon relationship between signifier and signified, every sign is actually multi-accentual, holding in a dialectical tension multiple meanings that, for him, map onto different social groups or classes. Thus, while, quote, various different classes will use one and the same language, differently oriented accents intersect in every ideological sign. Sign becomes an arena, of the class struggle, end quote. Insofar as a sign takes on an immutable, uniaccentual, or denotative quality, it is because the struggle over its meaning has been won by, quote, the ruling class, end quote. The stakes of this struggle are not just about the possibility that the powerful social groups are able to declare what words mean. It argues that this process of determining the meaning of words can work to delimit the boundaries of those groups, those subjectivities, and to justify forces of repression and hierarchy, or push for the abolition of those hierarchies altogether. Voloshinov says, quote, this inner dialectical quality of the sign comes out fully in the open only in times of social crisis or revolutionary changes, end quote. So, one particular moment of social crisis or revolutionary change was the introduction of the internet and the ability of people to stream and first download uh, media. And so the connotative meaning of those words become a way of having a larger connotation. So when movie and music corporations wanted to dissuade people from downloading their products over the internet, they began to use the term pirate to designate those who were sharing those bits of culture. They hoped that this would draw on what they thought was a settled denotation. Pirates are bad, right? But they ran up against a fairly robust cultural undercurrent that said pirates were actually kind of cool. And this resulted in pirate websites claiming the flag of the pirate and the emergence of pirate parties in European Parliament advocating for the abolition of copyright. And though they continued to push for their chosen connotation, the biggest of these corporations then decided that they would run with that renegade accent, turning a Disney theme park ride into a multi-billion-dollar pirate-themed franchise. The word thug is also an important side of struggle, as the player for the Seattle Seahawks, Richard Sherman, ran headlong into when the media began calling him this word after a particularly aggressive interaction with a white female reporter. But this term has long held a political connotation. The defining of who is called a thug or a pirate is one of the powers at play. The origin of the term thug comes from the early 1800s when the British East India Company, the largest private corporation of the time, began referring to roving bands of professional robbers in the subcontinent using this term. Part of what they were arguing with this word was that India was a dangerous place and they needed more military assistance, legal authority, and government funding to continue operating in an area overrun by these thugs. But of course, from the perspective of the average Indian inhabitant, it was not these bands of, quote, professional robbers and murderers that posed a threat. It was the ones employed by the East India Company. Defining who the actual thugs are becomes a sign of power. But perhaps no sign is more indicative of the way that connotations are a side of struggle right now than the term woke. The term is often attributed to the blues musician Leadbelly, who is said to tell people that they should, quote, stay woke and keep your eyes open when he was discussing the meaning of his song about the Scottsboro Boys. The Scottsboro Boys were 9 black teens falsely accused of raping 2 white women in 1931. They were sentenced to death, and the NAACP forced many retrials until, after 6 years in prison, they were finally freed and declared innocent. This phrase was then also used colloquially during the early days of the Black Lives Matter movement in much the same way. Stay woke, keep your eyes open, and watch out for the threats posed by racist institutions. But barely a decade after these movements came onto the scene, those interested in reaffirming the authority of those racist institutions have reappropriated the term to signify anyone promoting anti-racism or social justice more generally, such as when Florida Governor Ron DeSantis signed the Stop Woke Act in Florida. This act was eventually declared unconstitutional, but the phrasing and the use of this, the hint to determine this connotation has continued, uh, even if that is not entirely clear. Wokeness has effectively become a catch-all signifier for anything deemed to be ultimately problematic. So when the late Charlie Kirk said that, quote, wokeness was responsible for the LA wildfires, he meant not only the fact that there were several queer women in leadership positions in the Los Angeles Fire Department, or that the Los Angeles Fire Department had some DEI programs focused on creating inclusive workplaces. Not clearing brush and eliminating dams were also designated as woke. In this case, it doesn't actually matter if any of these things were actually causal or any of them were self described as woke. Pressing for the connotation of woke here does all the work of the argument. The same was the case when an ex Los Angeles sheriff, whose statements were quickly picked up by the right wing New York Post, said that the looting that followed the wildfires was also caused by wokeness. Although, again, there's no causal link here. The struggle to define woke in a particular way, of course, has become a sort of national sport, particularly for politicians and newspapers on the right. So, even though a hiring initiative that helped allow for more disabled air traffic controllers was signed by President Trump, it was called woke. And this wokeness, with no evidence, was blamed for the collision between an airplane and a military helicopter over Washington, D.C. in January 2025. On the day of that collision, the U.S. Department of Transportation had already prepared and released a statement and policy rescinding so called, quote, woke policies. But when we dig into these policies, the only actual initiatives they point to are some that have little bearing on the day to day operations of the transportation system and are more aimed at long term issues like equity, climate change, and environmental damage. What the concern of wokeness does is provide a screen or distraction from much larger issues. So, by focusing on the connotation of wokeness, we are not looking at the actual activity that it is supposed to designate, as when Doge cut contracts worth $400 million from the USDA budget, but the media and government spokespeople focused on the approximately $600,000 of those funds that went to, quote, woke issues. Drawing attention to the 0.15% of the cut funding as a way of excusing the rest is not the same as the struggle over the connotation of woke. But the assumed connotation of that term, that woke is bad, wasteful, or even evil, makes the synecdochal sleight of hand possible. Next time, we'll take this understanding of denotation and connotation, as well as the struggle over meaning, to talk about the concept of myth and to look at the ways we can use these ideas in our analysis today. Till then, take care.